The scratching started at 3 in the morning, not outside the window, not in the walls. Below her, Odessa Marsh lay still in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to something drag itself across the concrete floor of her basement, one slow scrape at a time. She told herself it was pipes settling. She told herself it was nothing. But nothing doesn't pause when you hold your breath. Nothing doesn't wait until you move to start again. She sat up. The floor beneath her feet felt colder than it should have. Somewhere below, a door she was certain she had locked creaked open on its own, the sound crawling up through the vents like a whisper aimed straight at her. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and pointed the flashlight at her bedroom door. It was still closed, still locked, yet the scratching kept going, patient, deliberate, like something down there had all the time in the world and knew exactly where she was. She would later learn that first night was nothing. The real horror hadn't even introduced itself yet. If that first sound already put a chill down your spine, imagine living through 5 more weeks of it. Hit that like button right now and subscribe, because this story is about to take you somewhere dark you won't be able to shake off. Stick around, because what happened in that basement gets so much worse. Odessa Marsh had lived in the house on Larkspur Hollow Road for a little over a year before anything felt wrong. It was a modest 2-story place with a basement she rarely used for anything besides storing old furniture and the treadmill she kept promising herself she'd start using again. She worked long shifts at a print shop downtown, came home tired, ate dinner standing at the counter most nights, and fell asleep with the television on low. Her life wasn't exciting, but it was hers, and after years of renting cramped apartments with paper-thin walls, that quiet, ordinary house felt like a small miracle. She wasn't the type to believe in things she couldn't explain. Her older sister, Wren, liked to tease her about it, calling her the skeptic whenever ghost stories came up around a fire pit or during a horror movie marathon. Odessa always had a rational answer ready. Old houses settle, pipes expand and contract, animals get into crawl spaces. She believed in those explanations, the way other people believed in gravity, without needing to think twice about it. That belief started to crack on an ordinary night that felt like any other. She had gone to bed a little after midnight, exhausted from a double shift, and had just drifted off when a sound pulled her back to the surface of sleep. It was faint at first, so faint she almost convinced herself she had dreamed it. A scrape, then another, then a third, slower, deliberate, like something dragging itself an inch at a time across a hard floor. She lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the walls around her bedroom either. It was coming from below her, from somewhere underneath the floorboards, from the basement she hadn't set foot in for nearly 2 weeks. Scratch, scratch, scratch. She told herself it was a raccoon that had somehow gotten into the crawl space beneath the house, or maybe a mouse dragging something across the concrete. She almost managed to convince herself of that story. Almost. Then the sound stopped, all at once, like a hand had reached out and silenced it. The stillness that followed was worse than the noise had been. It pressed against her ears until she could hear her own heartbeat. She grabbed her phone off the nightstand and checked the time. 2:58 in the morning. She would remember that number for the rest of her life, though she didn't know it yet. The next morning, in the gray light of an ordinary day, the whole thing felt almost silly. Odessa made coffee, scrolled through her phone, and told herself it really had been an animal. Houses on Larkspur Hollow Road were older, built with crawl spaces and gaps that critters love to exploit. She even called a pest control company and scheduled an inspection, feeling proud of herself for handling the situation like a rational adult instead of spiraling into something dramatic. The inspector came 2 days later, a broad-shouldered man named Terrence Philbrook, who spent nearly an hour checking the crawl space, the vents, and the foundation. He found nothing. No entry points, no droppings, no nests, no sign that any animal had ever been inside that basement. Whatever you heard, he told her, wiping dust off his hands, it wasn't coming from outside your house. Your foundation is sealed tight. If something's making noise down there, It's already inside. Those words sat with her longer than she wanted to admit. She thanked him, paid the bill, and spent the rest of that evening finding reasons to stay upstairs. The scratching came back the following night, and the night after that. Always around the same time. Always with that same slow, deliberate rhythm that made her skin crawl. She started sleeping with her bedroom door locked, a habit she'd never needed before in her own house. She told herself it was just for peace of mind, that locking a door against a sound made no logical sense, but she did it anyway. By the end of that first week, she had stopped sleeping through the night entirely. She would wake at exactly 2:58 every single time, as if some invisible alarm inside her body had synced itself to whatever was happening below her floor. Some nights the sound was faint, barely audible. Other nights it was so clear she could map its path across the basement floor in her mind, moving from one corner toward the stairs and then stopping just short of the door. She finally worked up the nerve to go down there herself on a night when the sound felt closer than it ever had. She stood at the top of the basement stairs in her socks, phone flashlight trembling in her hand, listening to her own breath echo off the walls. The scratching had stopped the moment her foot touched the top step, as though whatever was down there had heard her coming and gone quiet on purpose. She flipped the light switch. The bulbs flickered twice before catching, casting long yellow light across boxes. An old treadmill draped in a sheet, and the water heater humming quietly in the corner. Everything looked exactly the way she'd left it. Nothing was out of place. And yet the air near the bottom of the stairs was cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the season. Not the ordinary damp chill of a basement, but a cold that felt pointed, aimed, like standing in the wake of something that had just moved past her. She didn't go any further that night. She backed up the stairs, turned off the light, and sat on her couch until the sun came up. Phone gripped tightly in her hand, like it could protect her from something she couldn't even name. It was around that time she noticed the shadow. She had been sitting in her living room, lights on, curtains drawn, trying to distract herself with a show she wasn't really watching, when movement caught the edge of her vision. A shape passed along the hallway wall near the basement door, low and quick, gone before she could turn her head fully toward it. She told herself it was a trick of the light, the television throwing shapes across the room. But when she checked, the television was behind her, angled the wrong way to have caused it. She started keeping the hallway light on all night after that. The pattern grew worse as the days went on. The scratching no longer stayed confined to the far corner of the basement. It began to move, tracing new paths along the floor and up into the walls near the staircase, like something exploring the boundaries of its space, testing how far it could reach. Twice she heard what sounded like fingernails dragging slowly along the underside of the basement door itself, so close to where she stood at the top of the stairs that she felt the sound in her chest more than in her ears. She reached out to her sister, though she downplayed how bad things had actually gotten. Ren suggested she was just stressed from work, offered to come stay a night if it would help, and half-joked that Odessa was finally getting a taste of what she'd mocked other people for believing all those years. Odessa laughed along with her on the phone, but she didn't feel like laughing. She felt like something in her house had started paying very close attention to her, learning her habits, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a night she would never fully explain, not even to herself. She had fallen asleep on the couch instead of her bed, lights on, television murmuring low. She woke suddenly, the way you wake when your body senses danger before your mind catches up. The house was silent. No scratching, no shifting, just a silence so complete it felt like the air itself was holding still. Then, from somewhere down the hallway, near the basement door, she heard 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not scratching, not scraping, knocking. The kind of knock a person makes on a door when they want to be let inside. Odessa sat frozen on the couch, every muscle locked in place, staring down that dark hallway toward a door she had locked herself, toward a sound coming from a space beneath her house that had no way in and no way out except the one she had sealed with her own hands. And somewhere in the pit of her stomach, underneath the fear, a colder realization began to settle. Whatever was down there wasn't trying to get out anymore. It was trying to get her attention. If you felt that chill when those knocks started, imagine sitting alone in that house at that exact moment. Drop a comment with the words, "No way," if you already have a theory about what's down in that basement. And hit subscribe, because what Odessa discovers next is so much worse than a sound in the dark. Odessa didn't sleep at all after the knocking started. She sat on that couch until sunlight finally crawled through the curtains. And when it did, something in her shifted. The fear was still there, thick and constant. But underneath it, something new had taken root. She needed to understand what was happening in her own house. Fear without answers was starting to feel unbearable, and she decided that if she couldn't make the sounds stop, she would at least document every single one of them. She bought a small recording device from an electronics store on her way home from work, the kind used for voice memos, along with a motion-activated camera meant for wildlife trail monitoring. She set the camera at the base of the basement stairs, angled toward the open floor, and placed the recorder on a shelf near the water heater. Then she started a notebook, tracking every sound, every time, every detail she could remember, determined to find a pattern that made sense. The pattern she found only deepened the dread. Every single incident, without exception, occurred at 2:58 in the morning. Not 2:57, not 3 o'clock. Always that same minute, as consistent as a scheduled event. She stared at the string of matching timestamps in her notebook and felt something cold settle behind her ribs. Coincidences didn't behave with that kind of precision. Patterns like that meant intention. She brought her findings to her neighbor, an older woman named Maricela Ford, who had lived 2 houses down on Larkspur Hollow Road for over 30 years. Odessa had spoken to her only a handful of times before, mostly waves across the yard or brief conversations about garbage pickup schedules. But something told her Maricela might know more about the house than she was letting on during those small talk moments. She was right. Maricela invited her in for tea and listened to the whole story without interrupting once, her expression growing more troubled with every detail Odessa shared. When Odessa finished, Maricela set down her cup and was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "That house sat empty for almost 3 years before you bought it," she said. "The family before you left in the middle of the night didn't sell it right away either, just left, took what they could carry, and let the bank handle the rest." Odessa felt her stomach tighten. "Did they say why?" Maricela shook her head slowly. "Not directly, but I remember the wife, a quiet woman, telling me once that something in that basement knew her son's name, said it called for him at night. They had a boy, maybe 8 years old at the time. She said the walls in that house feel thin in places they shouldn't, like something on the other side is always just a little too close." Maricela reached across the table and gently touched Odessa's hand. "I always thought she meant it as a metaphor, dear. I'm starting to wonder if I was wrong." Odessa left that conversation more shaken than she wanted to admit. That night, she checked her recording equipment with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, half expecting the batteries to be dead or the footage to be empty. Instead, she found something far worse. The trail camera had captured nothing unusual for most of the night, just still frames of an empty basement floor. But at 2:58 exactly, a single frame showed something different. A shape near the edge of the frame, low to the ground, elongated in a way that didn't match anything with a normal skeleton. It was gone in the very next frame, as if it had never been there at all, except that one image remained, burned into her memory the moment she saw it. The recorder captured something even more disturbing. Beneath the scratching, buried under the static and ambient hum of the basement, there was a voice. Faint, distorted, layered with something that sounded like it was speaking through water or through old broken machinery, but unmistakably a voice, shaping actual words. She played it back 3 times before she was certain of what she heard. It said her name, not a name close to hers, not something she could explain away as her imagination filling gaps in random noise. It said Odessa clearly enough that her whole body went cold the moment she recognized it. Whatever was down there wasn't just present. It knew who she was. It had been listening to her, as closely as she had been listening to it. She should have moved out that night. Later, she would tell herself that 100 times. That the smart decision, the only decision, was to pack a bag and leave, and never look back. But something else took hold of her instead. Something that felt less like courage, and more like a compulsion she couldn't fully explain. She needed to know the truth, no matter how dangerous that need might be. 5 nights after finding that recording, Odessa sat at the top of her basement stairs at 2:55 in the morning, notebook in her lap, recorder in her hand, waiting. The house was silent in that particular way that made her ears ring. The silence right before something happens. At exactly 2:58, the scratching began, closer than it had ever been, as though it were happening just on the other side of the basement door. She opened her mouth before she could talk herself out of it. "Are you here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, shaking with every word. "Can you hear me?" The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt different from any silence before it. Heavier, charged, like the moment right before lightning strikes. Odessa sat frozen at the top of the stairs, recorder trembling in her outstretched hand, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then the voice answered. It came from directly behind the basement door, close enough that she felt certain if she reached out she could touch whatever was speaking. The voice was layered and strange, distorted like something being filtered through old static, through deep water, through a distance that shouldn't have existed between two things standing so close together. But the words themselves were painfully clear. It said her name again. And then it said something else, something that made her blood run cold and her breath catch painfully in her throat. "I remember you." Odessa didn't move. She couldn't. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was impossible, that whatever was speaking from behind that door had no business knowing her, remembering her, existing at all in the way it clearly did. But underneath the terror, a horrifying question rose up that she couldn't push back down. If it remembered her, that meant it had encountered her before, somewhere, somehow, in a way she had no memory of at all. She didn't sleep again that night, or the next. She reached out to a paranormal investigator whose name Maricela had given her, a man named Cassius Boone, who had spent nearly 15 years studying cases exactly like this one across the region. He agreed to come look at the house after hearing only a fraction of what Odessa had experienced, his voice going quiet and serious the moment she mentioned the recording and the timestamp that never changed. He arrived on a gray, overcast afternoon, carrying equipment Odessa didn't recognize, meters and sensors, and a small case of tools he handled with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. He walked the perimeter of the basement slowly, running a device along the walls that clicked and beeped in patterns Odessa couldn't interpret. When he reached the far corner, near the water heater, the device let out a long, steady tone that didn't stop until he pulled it away. "There's something anchored here," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Something old, and it isn't finished with this house yet." Odessa asked him what that meant, what anchored was supposed to imply, but Cassius only shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "I need one more night to be sure," he said. "But if I'm right about what this is, the next time it makes contact might be the most important moment in this whole case. And it might also be the most dangerous." That night, as Cassius set up additional equipment throughout the basement, Odessa sat upstairs staring at her notebook, at the long column of matching timestamps, at the frame from the trail camera she still couldn't look at for more than a few seconds at a time. She thought about the family who had lived there before her, about a mother's voice on Maricela's porch describing walls that felt too thin, about a little boy whose name she still didn't know. She thought about the voice saying it remembered her. And somewhere just past midnight, as she finally started to drift toward an uneasy sleep, she heard Cassius call her name from downstairs, his voice tight with an urgency that snapped her fully awake in an instant. "Odessa, you need to see this, now." If your heart is pounding right now the same way Odessa's was on those stairs, Smash that like button and drop the word "reveal it" in the comments, because the final episode is about to answer every single question this story has been building toward, and the truth is worse than anyone expected. Odessa moved down the basement stairs faster than she thought her legs could carry her, heart slamming against her ribs with every step. She found Cassius crouched near the water heater, his equipment spread across the concrete floor, his face lit from below by the glow of a small monitor connected to one of his sensors. He didn't look up right away. When he finally did, his expression carried a weight that frightened her more than any sound the house had made so far. "I picked this up about 10 minutes ago," he said, turning the monitor toward her. "I need you to listen carefully, and I need you to understand that what you're about to hear isn't a threat." "I don't think it ever was." He played the recording. Beneath the familiar scratching, beneath the static and distortion, the voice returned, clearer than it had ever been before, as though whatever force controlled it had finally found enough strength to speak, without struggling against the distance between them. "I remember you," the voice said again, the same words from before. But this time, it continued, and what followed changed everything Odessa thought she understood about the past several weeks. "You used to sit right here. You used to talk to me. Before you were afraid." Odessa felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I've never heard this voice before in my life. I would remember something like this." Cassius studied her carefully, the way someone studies a puzzle piece that refuses to fit, no matter how many angles they try. "Not necessarily," he said slowly. "Some residual entities don't attach to a house because of tragedy alone. Sometimes they attach because of a person, a specific connection formed long before that person even realizes it happened. Odessa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think before you answer. Did you ever live somewhere near here as a child? Somewhere close by? Maybe somewhere you don't remember clearly?" The question hit her like a physical blow, because the answer, buried under years she rarely thought about, was yes. Her family had moved constantly during her early childhood, chasing whatever work her father could find, and there had been a stretch of maybe 2 years when they'd lived somewhere in this same town, in a rental house she barely remembered, except in fragmented, dreamlike pieces. A basement with a single bare bulb, a drafty corner where she used to sit and talk to herself as a very young child, the way lonely kids sometimes invent companions to keep themselves company. She had always assumed that memory was exactly that, a child's imagination filling in the isolation of frequent moves and few friends. She had never once considered that the companion she remembered whispering to in that long-forgotten basement might have been real, and might have followed the thread of her presence across years and streets until it found her again, in this house, in this basement, calling her name in the dark. "I think I lived somewhere near here once," she admitted quietly. "A long time ago. I don't remember much about it." Cassius nodded slowly, as though a missing piece had finally clicked into place. That would explain the specificity, the attachment. Entities like this, when they form a bond that deep, they don't always let go just because the physical distance changes. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they search, in whatever limited way something like this is capable of searching, until the connection reconnects on its own. The idea should have offered some comfort, the possibility that whatever lived in her basement wasn't some malevolent stranger, but something old and strange that had simply been waiting for her, in its own way, for a very long time. Instead, it terrified her more deeply than anything before it, because it meant the fear she'd felt every night for weeks hadn't been keeping her safe from a threat. It had been keeping her from something that considered itself, in some broken and incomprehensible fashion, already close to her. They decided to attempt direct contact that same night, while Cassius's equipment was still running, while whatever strength the entity had gathered was still present. Odessa sat on the bottom step of the basement stairs, notebook forgotten, recorder running, every nerve in her body strung tight. Cassius stood nearby, watching his instruments carefully, ready to intervene if anything shifted in a direction he didn't like. "Ask it what it wants," he said quietly. "Sometimes, That's the only question that actually matters. Odessa's voice shook as she spoke into the dark basement air. What do you want from me? The silence stretched long enough that she began to think nothing would answer at all. Then the temperature in the room dropped sharply, sudden enough that she watched her own breath appear in front of her for the first time, despite the season having nothing to do with cold. The voice returned. Closer now. So close it felt like it was speaking from directly beside her, rather than from the shadows across the room. Don't leave again, it said. Everyone always leaves. The words landed with a heaviness Odessa hadn't expected, something almost sorrowful beneath the strange distortion of the voice. She thought of the family before her, of the mother telling Maricela about a presence that called for her son at night, of a house left empty for 3 years because whatever waited inside it had frightened away every family that tried to make it home. She wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, how many people across how many years had unknowingly formed some kind of bond with this thing, only to run the moment fear outweighed curiosity. I'm not trying to leave, she said carefully, unsure if the words were even true yet. I just want to understand what you are, why you're here, why any of this is happening. Another long silence. Then, so quietly she almost missed it entirely, the voice spoke one final time that night. I don't remember what I was. I only remember waiting. The recording equipment cut to static immediately after those words, every device in the basement losing signal at the exact same moment, screens flickering to black before slowly rebooting themselves one by one. Cassius checked his equipment, brow furrowed, and confirmed what Odessa already feared. Whatever had been present in that basement was gone, at least for the moment, its energy apparently spent, after finally managing to communicate something resembling a full thought. Over the following days, Odessa tried to make sense of everything she had learned. Cassius performed what he called a cleansing ritual throughout the house, a process involving salt, specific herbs, and words spoken with a solemn seriousness that felt strange to witness in her own basement, yet somehow appropriate given everything that had happened. He warned her honestly that rituals like this didn't always work permanently, that some attachments were simply too old, too rooted, to be fully severed in a single attempt. The scratching didn't return that week, or the week after. The knocking stopped entirely. Odessa began sleeping through the night again, for the first time, in what felt like a lifetime, though she still found herself waking occasionally at 2:58, her body holding on to the memory of those weeks, even after the house itself had gone quiet. She tried to play back her final recordings one more time, hoping to study the voice more closely, to understand it better, now that the immediate fear had faded into something closer to sorrow. Every single file was corrupted beyond recovery, the audio replaced with nothing but static, the video reduced to broken, unreadable fragments. It was as though something had made absolutely certain that no proof of that final conversation would ever survive past the night it happened. Odessa still lives in that house on Larkspur Hollow Road. She still doesn't fully understand what shared her basement with her for those 6 terrifying weeks, or what exact thread connected a lonely, imaginative little girl from a house she barely remembers to a presence patient enough to wait decades for that connection to complete itself again. She has since learned to be more careful about the things she dismisses as imagination, more willing to sit with uncertainty instead of forcing every strange experience into a box labeled explainable. Some nights, when the house goes especially quiet, she swears she can still feel something listening from just beyond the basement door, patient as ever, no longer frightening in quite the same way, but never entirely gone either. She has never gone looking for it again, but she has also never stopped wondering whether, somewhere in the silence beneath her feet, something is still waiting for her to sit down and talk to it the way she once did, long before she learned to be afraid of the dark. Thank you for staying until the end of this chronicle. You didn't have to, but you did, and that means everything. Every story we tell exists because of listeners like you, who are drawn to the dark, who respect the truth behind the terror, and who believe these stories deserve to be heard. If this chronicle moved you, unsettled you, or made you think, share it. Someone out there needs to hear this story. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, where darkness is documented, truth survives. This has been the Dark Chronicles. Subscribe and become part of the Chronicle.